O God, though my words will be spoken today, may only your word be heard. Amen.
Amen.
Please make yourselves comfortable. You know, I say that just about every Sunday I preach, and today I really mean it. Today's reading from the book of Nehemiah tells a part of the story of the emergence of the Jewish people from their Babylonian exile, 600 years before the birth of Christ. Before the exile in 586 BC, the emperor Nebuchadnezzar invaded the kingdom of Judah and destroyed the temple of Solomon in Jerusalem and the city itself. Thousands of survivors were taken into exile and essentially displaced out of their homeland and away from their culture, away from their teachings, and away from their familiar social and familial arrangements. You can imagine that not only was this a violent episode in the lives of these Judeans, this also was extremely disorienting. Everything that they had come to rely on as a people to define themselves as a people and to remain connected to God was gone. The temple, at the center of their worship and entire religious expression, was destroyed. They were taken away, and they only had each other and their collective memories and reminders of their faith and sacred texts. For about 50 years, the people stayed in Babylon. 50 years is a long time. It's enough time for 2 generations to reach adulthood in exile. And in exile, they could not worship at a central temple together and collectively, or even hear the words of Torah in public as a community. During this time, different practices emerged, including individual study of Torah, the gathering at synagogues, and practices at home. The priests that were once central to temple sacrifice were replaced by scribes and rabbis whose study of the sacred texts and interpretation of those texts and the law became central to their religious identity as a people. A new expression of Judaism emerged during the exile, really out of necessity. After 50 years of exile, these new practices became firmly cemented in the culture of the Jewish people, but they never forgot their roots and their home and their history. In 536 BCE, roughly 50 years after the exile began, King Cyrus of Persia allowed the Jewish people to return home to Judea. And those memories handed down over generations inspired them to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and the city walls. The prophet Ezra is connected with the rebuilding of the temple, and Nehemiah is connected with the rebuilding of the walled city. And in today's reading from the book of Nehemiah, we hear of their return to the city, to the place so central in their faith, on the first day of the 7th month, the date of Rosh Hashanah in the modern Jewish calendar. While the temple still remained in ruins, the people gathered as a community out in public, out in the open, to hear the reading of the entire Torah that existed at that time. Listening to and learning from these sacred texts that defined who they were as a people expressed a kind of universality in what was being taught, at least as universal as they could imagine at that time. All people gathered, all the people listened and heard the words. All were included, men, women, children, anyone who could hear and understand. They stood together with one another, gathered as God's people, a thing that would not have been possible 50 or 60 years earlier when temple worship was more exclusive. And I think we can imagine the emotional outpouring that would have been present this day. I imagine having been in exile for up to 2 generations, the people gathered probably wailed and cried and kissed the ground and had any number of emotional expressions. But they were reminded that rather than mourning or lamenting or grieving over the time that had passed, this was a time to rejoice and celebrate. Not a time to fast, but a time to feast. And to extend that feast to everyone. To make sure everyone was invited to the feast and fed abundantly. The people were reminded of the goodness and love of God. A goodness so deep and so true that even the earth rejoices in a language all her own, as the psalmist says, in a sound that emanates to the lands, spreading creation's message to the ends of the earth, the glory of God. 500 years later, God's people endured exile anew. This time they wouldn't be moved or removed from their homeland or their temple. Instead, they would experience an exile in place. In Jesus' time, the people would suffer under Roman occupation with puppet priests who were agents of the empire, dressed in a thin veneer of religious authority. For those who worshiped as God's people, this new experience of exile in place was disorienting, and it separated them from their true worship of God, elevating false idols and people loyal to the emperor. It is in this political, cultural, and religious backdrop that Jesus stands to speak. Luke's author places him in the synagogue, reaching back into the prophetic literature of God's people and drawing out the words of the prophet in Babylon. Of restoration, transformation, not only in a spiritual sense, but in an economic, in a material, and in a political sense, ensuring that the realities of people's real, concrete, lived experiences reflected in both spiritual and material ways their dignity as God's people. In this moment, Jesus tells the people and announces to the community that the restoration of God's people is at hand. Restoration in every sense. Spiritual, yes, and also political, social, economic, in every sense, to ensure that it reflected the dignity of God's people and God's creation. There are many ways that people can find themselves in exile. We can find ourselves in exile while still living in our own homes and in our own homeland. Exile is marked by dislocation and disorientation. The exile experience is an experience of feeling lost and overwhelmed, of wandering in an often dangerous and inhospitable place. The experience of exile, of being cut off from what sustains us and what is needed to sustain community. This experience is one of grief and pain and oppression. It's an experience of lament and sorrow, an experience of struggle just to keep our dreams alive, a struggle just to retain our memories of what is true, to ensure it is not replaced by false idols and lies. Our readings today remind us of God's promises to us, and particularly to those of us who are beginning to feel like we're in a new kind of exile, a new exile in place, where false idols and political actors dressed in a thin veneer of religious authority obscure and distort what is real, what is true, and what is good. Our readings this morning also remind us of the liberating work that God still seeds in us and through the whole of creation. that we might declare the majesty of God and care for one another in light of our God-given dignity as God's people. That we might care for one another in every sense of that word, to ensure that our concrete, physical, political, social, and economic realities reflect what we have come to know as true, that we are loved beyond measure, each of us and all of us, and that each of us has dignity with which God created us. For those of us who feel we are standing in the midst of the ruins of our own dreams and hopes this day, for those of us who are scared about what will befall us and our siblings, we are reminded of the people who held on to a hope of return for generations. We're reminded of the God-man who walked among us and stood and taught and reminded the people that God's promises were being fulfilled in their midst, even if it was hard to see God at work. God's seeding was happening. God's seeding is happening. God continues to plant the seeds of love and justice and the seeds of courage to embrace that new thing happening in our midst, empowering each of us to stand facing the empire and the powers of death and destruction, the powers that are dehumanizing, that would seek to separate us from one another and distort what is true, and to proclaim anew through our words and through our shared work in the world, the Spirit of the Lord is upon us, because God has anointed us to bring good news to the poor. God sends us to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim this, the year of the Lord's favor. Amen.